I take the same bus to work every morning. It's part of my routine, a peaceful 30-minute ride where I can sit back, put on my headphones, and enjoy a bit of quiet before the chaos of the day begins. My usual spot is the third seat from the back, next to the window. It's comfortable, lets me lean against the side, and most importantly, it keeps me away from the main crowd at the front. I never thought much about it. It was just a seat, one of many. But apparently, to someone else, it was much more. The first time I noticed her, she was standing near the front, scanning the bus like she was inspecting something. She was dressed in a beige blouse, an expensive-looking handbag clutched in one hand, and she had this air about her, like she was used to being in charge. At first, I didn't pay much attention. People watch others all the time on public transport. But when her gaze locked onto me, something about the way her eyes narrowed made me uneasy. I turned away, thinking nothing of it. The next day, she was there again. This time, she got on the bus and walked straight toward me. Without a word, she stood in front of my seat, staring down at me like she expected me to read her mind. I took out one earbud, raising an eyebrow, waiting for her to say something. She let out a sigh, the kind people make when they're inconvenienced. Then, in a tone dripping with forced politeness, she said, "Excuse me, but I usually sit there." I blinked, confused. I had been taking this bus for over a year, and I had never seen her before. "Oh," I said, glancing at the empty seats around us. "I didn't know. There are plenty of seats open, though." She pursed her lips, as if I had just said something deeply offensive. "Yes, but I prefer this one," she said, tapping the back of the seat with her manicured fingers. "I always sit here." I didn't know what to say to that. Was she expecting me to move just because she liked my seat? I gave her a small shrug and put my earbud back in. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The next day, she was there again. This time, she didn't ask. She simply stood in front of me, waiting. When I didn't move, she sighed loudly, muttering something about young people these days, before sitting in the row across from me. I ignored her, thinking she'd get over it. But the next morning, she was back, and this time, she had an entirely new approach. "I don't think you understand," she said, arms crossed. "I always sit here. It's a routine. It helps me start my day right." I let out a small laugh, thinking she was joking. But her face remained deadly serious. "That's great," I said. "But it's a public bus. First come, first served." Her expression tightened. "You don't understand how important routines are, do you?" she said. "They help people function. And I need my seat." I wasn't trying to be difficult, but the entitlement was ridiculous. "Then get here earlier," I said, gesturing to the bus full of empty seats. "There's plenty of space." She let out a huff and stormed toward the front of the bus. I figured that was the end of it. She'd realize how absurd she was being and move on. But I had underestimated just how determined she was. The next morning, I got on the bus as usual, but something was off. My seat was taken. Not by her, but by someone else, a younger guy, maybe in his 20s. As I walked past, I noticed him glance up nervously, then look away. Strange, but whatever. I sat a few rows back and went about my day. But then I saw her. She was sitting 2 rows ahead, in a seat that gave her a clear view of mine. And she was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but a smug, victorious one. That's when I realized, she had asked someone to sit there, just to keep me from getting my usual spot. I wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or impressed. Who goes to that level of effort just to claim a seat on a bus? I decided to ignore it. I wasn't going to turn this into some childish game. If she wanted to feel like she won, fine. But I should have known that for people like her, one victory is never enough. The following day, I arrived earlier than usual, determined to avoid whatever scheme she had planned. I got my seat, put in my headphones, and relaxed. Then, just as the bus doors closed, she appeared. She stopped in the aisle next to me, her smile faltering as she realized I had gotten there first. For a moment, she stood there, gripping her bag, her jaw tightening. Then, instead of sitting somewhere else, she turned and marched straight to the driver. A minute later, the driver approached me. "Hey," he said, sounding a little uncomfortable. This lady says you're in her seat." I couldn't help it. I laughed. "It's a public bus," I said. "There are no assigned seats." The driver scratched the back of his head. "Yeah, I know, but she's saying it's her routine, and she's asking if you'd be willing to move." Now I was annoyed. She wasn't just being entitled, she was trying to make it someone else's problem. "I've been sitting here for a year," I said. "I think that makes it just as much my routine as hers." The driver sighed, clearly not wanting to deal with the situation. He turned back to her. "Ma'am, he's not doing anything wrong." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stalked off, taking a seat near the front, fuming. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. But I was wrong. She wasn't done. Not even close. The next day, I was more prepared. I got to the bus stop early, ensuring I'd get my usual seat without any hassle. When the bus arrived, I stepped on, sat down in my usual spot, and prepared for another peaceful ride. But as soon as I glanced up, I saw her standing near the front, staring at me with an expression that could have melted steel. It was clear she wasn't letting this go. I looked away, determined not to engage. But within moments, she was marching down the aisle again, standing right next to me with her arms folded, her nails tapping against her handbag in irritation. This time, she didn't even pretend to be polite. She exhaled sharply and muttered under her breath about how some people had no consideration, making sure her voice was just loud enough for me to hear. I ignored her, pretending to be absorbed in my phone. The bus ride was long and silent, except for her occasional sighs of frustration, but eventually, she gave up and sat somewhere else. I thought that was the end of it, but the next morning, she came back with reinforcements. This time, she wasn't alone. A woman, probably around the same age as her, followed her onto the bus, whispering something into her ear before looking directly at me. As I settled into my seat, I could already feel their eyes burning holes into me. They sat a few rows ahead, speaking in hushed voices, occasionally glancing in my direction, shaking their heads dramatically as if I were some sort of criminal. The bus rolled forward, and though I tried to focus on my phone, I could hear them clearly. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. They spoke about how rude people had become, how respect was vanishing, and how some people clearly had no manners or understanding of social rules. I knew they were talking about me, but I refused to engage. It was childish, ridiculous, and frankly, pathetic. I wasn't about to move just because a couple of entitled women thought they could pressure me into giving up a public seat. For the next few days, the pattern continued. Sometimes, she came alone. Other times, she brought her friend or another acquaintance, making it a group effort to shame me into submission. At one point, they sat close enough that I could hear them discussing how people should learn to accommodate those who had been sitting in the same place for years. It was absurd because I had never seen this woman before she decided my seat belonged to her. She acted like I had stolen something that was rightfully hers, and she had made it her personal mission to reclaim it. At this point, it was no longer about comfort or routine. It was about control. I decided to test something. One day, I deliberately sat in a different seat, one near the middle of the bus, just to see what she would do. The moment she stepped on, she hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward my usual seat, then toward me. For a brief second, she looked triumphant, as if she had finally won. But then, her face twisted in confusion. Instead of sitting in her so-called favorite spot, she stood still, staring at me. I had expected her to celebrate, to reclaim her seat and move on. But she didn't. Instead, she chose a completely different seat, one near the front. That's when I realized it had nothing to do with the seat itself. She didn't want that seat. She just didn't want me to have it. The next morning, I went back to my usual spot, and sure enough, she was there, waiting like clockwork. This time, she didn't speak. She simply stood there, gripping the overhead bar, staring at me with an expression of pure resentment. I stared back, unbothered. The bus continued on, and she refused to sit down anywhere else. She stood the entire ride, gripping the bar tightly, occasionally swaying slightly as the vehicle turned corners. Rather stand than admit defeat, and I had to admit, it was almost impressive how committed she was to this nonsense. That should have been the end of it. She had made her point, and I had made mine. But then, she decided to escalate things further. One morning, I stepped onto the bus and noticed something strange. My usual seat was empty, but there was something resting on it. A large handbag had been carefully placed on the seat, right in the middle, blocking anyone from sitting there. I didn't have to guess whose it was. She was standing nearby, watching, waiting to see if I would back down. I glanced at her, then at the bag. I could feel other passengers watching, sensing the tension that had been building for days. I knew what she was trying to do. She was marking her territory, trying to make it clear that this seat was hers by placing her belongings there before I could sit down. I wasn't about to let her win that easily. Without hesitation, I reached down, picked up the bag, and moved it to the empty seat next to mine. Then, I sat down as if nothing had happened. I felt her eyes widen in shock, as if she couldn't believe I had the audacity to touch her belongings. She sucked in a sharp breath and muttered something under her breath, but she didn't protest. She simply picked up her bag, clutched it tightly, and stormed toward the front of the bus. I knew that wouldn't be the last of it. She wasn't the type to give up so easily. The next morning, I was proven right. I stepped onto the bus, only to find her already there, sitting in my seat. She had finally done what she should have done from the beginning, arrived earlier to claim the seat for herself. I almost laughed at how ridiculous it all was. If she had done this from the start, there wouldn't have been an issue. But now, she was sitting there, stiff-backed, staring straight ahead like she had won some grand war. It was such a petty victory that I almost let her have it. Almost. Instead of walking away, I did exactly what she had been doing to me for the past week. I walked down the aisle, stopped right in front of her, and stood there, waiting. She refused to look at me, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew exactly what I was doing. The silence stretched on, passengers around us shifting uncomfortably, sensing the standoff. After a long moment, she finally turned her head slightly, just enough to glance up at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. I raised an eyebrow, tilting my head, silently asking if she was going to move. She clenched her jaw, clearly frustrated, but she wasn't going to back down. Fine. If she wanted to play that game, I'd let her have her moment. I sat down in the seat directly across from her, meeting her glare with an amused expression. If she thought she had won, she was wrong. This wasn't about the seat anymore. It never had been. It was about control, about proving a point. And I wasn't going to let her dictate where I sat, no matter how many passive-aggressive games she wanted to play. For the rest of the ride, she refused to look in my direction, but I could tell she was fuming. The next day, she was back in her usual seat near the front, pretending as if none of it had ever happened. She had finally realized that no matter what she did, I wasn't going to give in. It had taken over a week of ridiculous power plays, but in the end, she had lost. And that made my bus ride just a little more enjoyable. For the next few days, everything seemed to return to normal. She sat at the front like she had before, and I reclaimed my usual spot without issue. There were no more confrontations, no passive-aggressive comments, no staged battles for dominance. The bus ride was peaceful again, and for a brief moment, I thought she had finally given up. Maybe she had realized how ridiculous the whole thing was. Maybe she had accepted that she couldn't dictate where I sat. Or maybe, just maybe, she was simply regrouping, preparing for another move. I should have known better than to assume it was over. One morning, I got onto the bus and noticed that my usual seat was occupied. It wasn't by her this time, but by someone else, a man in his 40s who I had never seen before. He sat there casually, scrolling through his phone, as if he had been sitting there for years. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a public seat, after all. But then I saw her, sitting at the front, watching. Her eyes flicked toward me for a brief second before she turned her head, feigning indifference. That's when I knew. She had told someone else to take my seat. I wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or amused. It was almost impressive how much effort she was willing to put into this ridiculous battle. Instead of causing a scene, I simply moved to another spot, determined not to give her the reaction she wanted. But the next day, the same thing happened. And the day after that. Every morning, a different person would be sitting in my spot, someone new each time, but always someone who boarded the bus just before I did. And every morning, she would be sitting nearby, pretending not to notice. It became obvious that this wasn't a coincidence. She was orchestrating this, convincing people to take the seat before I could, just to prove a point. It was a ridiculous, childish game, and the fact that she was going to these lengths to win it was almost laughable. But I refused to let it bother me. If she wanted to play this game, fine. I wouldn't engage. I would sit somewhere else, act as if I didn't care, and wait for her to grow tired of whatever power trip she was on. Days passed, then weeks. Each morning, a new person would take my spot, and each morning, would sit elsewhere without complaint. The tension never completely faded, but I could feel her frustration growing. She wanted me to react, to argue, to push back. But I didn't. I simply carried on, unaffected, as if none of it mattered. And eventually, it seemed like she started to lose interest. Then, just when I thought she had finally let it go, she escalated things in a way I never could have predicted. One morning, I stepped onto the bus as usual, expecting the same routine. But this time, something was different. The bus was more crowded than usual, and there was a low murmur of conversation among the passengers. People were whispering, glancing at me, exchanging amused looks. I didn't understand what was going on until I saw her. She was sitting at the front, her arms crossed, her expression smug. And that's when I noticed the sign. Taped to the seat where I usually sat was a piece of paper, printed neatly in bold letters. Reserved. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it in disbelief. This was a public bus. There were no assigned seats, no reservations. And yet, here it was, a sign, taped down with care, claiming the seat as if it belonged to her. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. I looked around, expecting someone else to be just as baffled as I was, but instead, people just smirked and shook their heads. They knew what was happening. They had been watching this ridiculous standoff unfold for weeks, and now, they were seeing how far she was willing to go. I considered my options. I could have removed the sign and sat down anyway, but I knew that was exactly what she wanted. She was waiting for me to react, waiting for me to argue, to acknowledge her game. And I refused to give her that satisfaction. So, without missing a beat, I walked past the seat, ignoring it completely, and sat somewhere else. I didn't even glance in her direction, didn't acknowledge her victory, didn't let her see even the smallest hint of frustration. I just carried on as if she didn't exist. For the entire ride, she didn't move. She sat perfectly still, waiting, watching, waiting for me to crack. But I didn't. And when the bus finally reached my stop, I got up and left without a second glance. She had won this round, but it wasn't over. I knew she wasn't done. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. I wanted to see what would happen, wanted to see if she would go through the trouble of taping up another sign. Sure enough, as I stepped onto the bus, there it was, another, reserved, sign, placed neatly on the same seat. And this time, she was already sitting nearby, waiting. But I didn't take the bait. I didn't acknowledge it. I walked past it again, sat somewhere else, and ignored her completely. This continued for days. Each morning, a new sign appeared, and each morning, I ignored it. She was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to argue, to protest. But I wouldn't. And the more I ignored her, the more restless she became. It was clear that she wanted a reaction, that she needed me to engage. And when I didn't, she finally started to unravel. One morning, after nearly a week of the reserved signs being ignored, she finally snapped. I had just sat down in a different seat when she stood up abruptly, ripped the sign off the seat, and stormed toward the front of the bus. I could hear her voice rising as she spoke to the driver, though I couldn't make out the words. The driver sighed, looking completely exhausted, then turned to glance at me. For a moment, I thought he was about to ask me to move, but instead, he just shook his head and gestured for her to sit down. She didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel and stomped back to her seat, glaring at me with a fury that could have burned a hole through steel. She had lost. Completely, utterly lost. She had tried everything: intimidation, guilt-tripping, roping in other passengers, even staging a fake reservation system. And none of it had worked. I hadn't fought back, hadn't engaged, hadn't played into her hands. I had simply refused to let her control the situation. And that, more than anything, had driven her absolutely mad. From that day on, the signs disappeared. The tension remained, but she no longer tried to claim the seat. She sat at the front, fuming in silence, pretending I didn't exist. And I, in turn, did the same. The battle was over. She had fought hard, but in the end, she had lost. And finally, after weeks of pointless games, I had won. For the next few days, the bus ride felt different. Not because anything had physically changed, but because the tension that had been building for weeks had finally started to settle. The signs were gone, and she no longer stood next to my seat, waiting for me to move. She still sat at the front, her posture rigid, her expression permanently set in a mix of frustration and bitterness, but she had stopped engaging. It was almost eerie how silent it had become. For so long, she had made it her mission to control the situation, to make me bend, to force me to acknowledge her authority, but now, it seemed like she had run out of ways to do it. The other passengers had noticed too. For weeks, they had watched the back and forth unfold, some amused, others irritated by the unnecessary drama. Now, as things finally calmed down, I could see the relief on their faces. Nobody wanted to be trapped in a never-ending power struggle over something as insignificant as a bus seat. People had places to be, lives to live, and yet, for reasons only she could understand, she had made this personal. But now, she was defeated, and that defeat seemed to weigh on her more than anything else. I expected her to move on, to forget about it and go back to whatever her routine had been before she decided to fixate on me. But she didn't. Instead, she found a new way to make her presence known. She never spoke to me, never confronted me again, but I could feel her eyes on me every time I boarded the bus. Every morning, I would take my seat, put in my headphones, and pretend she didn't exist, but I could always sense her watching. It wasn't the same open hostility as before, not the aggressive kind that demanded action. It was quieter now, more subtle, but it was still there. A lingering presence that refused to let go. It would have been easy to ignore if not for the way she started getting off at my stop. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe she had always gotten off there, and I had just never noticed before. But then I started paying attention. She would get off at the same stop as me, only to wait for the next bus. She wouldn't walk in any particular direction, wouldn't seem to have anywhere to go. She would just stand there at the bus stop, glancing at her watch, pretending to be preoccupied, waiting for the next ride to take her somewhere else. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. The second time, I found it strange. By the third and fourth time, I knew it wasn't just random chance. She wasn't doing it because she needed to. She was doing it because she wanted me to know that she was still there. She wanted to remind me that this wasn't over, that even though she had lost, she still had control in some way. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about presence. About making sure I never forgot that she had been there, that she had fought, that she had made her mark. I never acknowledged her, never gave her the reaction she wanted. If she thought she could unsettle me by simply existing in my space, she was wrong. I continued my routine as usual, walking past her without a second glance, never giving her the satisfaction of knowing she was getting to me. Eventually, she had to realize that whatever point she was trying to make was meaningless. And then, one morning, just as suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. She wasn't there. She didn't get on the bus, didn't take her usual seat at the front, didn't stand near the stop after getting off. It was like she had simply vanished. At first, I didn't believe it. I expected her to reappear the next day, to resume her strange ritual of silent intimidation. But she didn't. A week passed, then another, and still, she was gone. It was over. I never found out why she stopped. Maybe she had finally realized how ridiculous the whole thing had been. Maybe she had gotten bored, moved on to some other fixation, found someone else to control. Or maybe, just maybe, she had finally understood that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she was never going to win. Whatever the reason, I didn't care. The bus ride returned to normal. The tension faded, the stares disappeared, and for the first time in weeks, I could sit back, relax, and enjoy the quiet. It was strange how something so insignificant could turn into such a ridiculous battle, how one person's sense of entitlement could spiral into an unnecessary conflict. But in the end, it had all amounted to nothing. And as I leaned back against the seat, feeling the familiar comfort of my usual spot, I realized something. Some battles aren't worth fighting. But sometimes, standing your ground, even over something as small as a bus seat, is enough to remind people that they don't get to dictate your life. And for me, that was victory enough.